Okay, so today we're going to talk about the modes of melodic minor. This is a super useful scale when we're improvising in jazz. There are four really, really useful modes. The other ones are kind of fun to mess around with too. But four of them, as we'll see, have some very, very great practical applications as far as improvising goes. So let's jump right in with the melodic minor scale itself. So, many of you are used to already playing the scale. Generally, what we would do is we would play a melodic minor scale like this. In other words, on the way up, it has that natural 6 and the natural 7 in it, and then on the way down, usually what we would do is we would flat that 7 and 6. And the reason that that scale exists and that we practice it is, if you look at classical music, generally if melodies are going up in a minor key, they tend to conform to that ascending portion of that melodic minor scale. And when melodies are going down in a minor key, they tend to go with the flat 6 and flat 7. However, in jazz, we're actually going to extrapolate some harmony out of this scale and its modes, and we're going to find that there are really, really some nice places in the music that we can apply the scale to add color to our improvisation. So let's just take a look at this scale itself. So, it's pretty much a major scale that's got a flatted third in it, right? So, maybe that's a way that we could number it. We could call it like Ionian with a flat 3. But some people also call it Dorian with a sharp 7. So that's a whole debate that we don't need to get into. We're just going to call it melodic minor. So this is a minor tetrachord and a major tetrachord, a whole step apart, right? Once again, the ascending portion only. The stacked version, I'm going to take this down an octave. Actually really, really nice, right? I mean, there are no avoid tones there. However, by definition, if we keep going and go up to the root here, it is possible to form a flat 9 interval with a basic note of the chord. And the basic chord here is actually a minor with a major 7 in it. It's kind of that James Bond sort of shaken not stirred sort of sound, right? But upper register root does create that flat 9 interval. So technically that's an avoid tone. Not too bad though. I kind of don't mind the sound of that as much as perhaps I don't like it in major. But once again, if you have that root at the end of the tune, generally what we might do is, make it a minor 6-9 chord as opposed to a minor with a major 7. Okay, same sort of function. So speaking of that, here's some melodic minor chords. Here's a just good old minor with a major 7. Whoops, let's try that again. Kind of a spread out voicing there. I forgot the major 7. There we go. Add the 9th in there for a little bit of color. Very, very nice. These function really, really nice as one chord in a minor key or a temporary minor key. Also, if we put the major 7 on the top there and then put that 13 down here, we get a minor major 7 with a 13 in there. We call that C minor 13 with a major 7. Once again, that has that avoid tone of the upper register root. Taking out that major 7th, right? We get a scale that has, a chord that has no avoid tones in it. Same thing here if we add in that 9th. So minor 6-9, another nice quality of a 1 chord, right? Notice I didn't put any Fs in those voicings. It's possible, it's a thing, it's not very common. It kind of tends to darken the sound of that minor chord. I also put a little note here you may have noticed. It says, can be played on a minor 7th chord with care. So yeah, like say I have a C minor 7 chord. I mean, the difference really is going to be the B flat versus that B natural, right? So if I have a C minor 7, that maybe is going to F7, I could kind of mess around with You know, I can kind of mess around with that melodic minor scale as sort of just a colorful minor scale that does sound nice. I just wouldn't sit, right? I couldn't sit on that major seventh, right? But I can use it. Can use it as like a passing tone or a lower neighbor to the root. Actually, it's kind of one of my favorite things to do on a minor seventh chord. So, so kind of two really, you know, different functions of that scale, playing it over the one chord itself in a minor key, or using it as kind of a substitute scale to play over a minor seventh, just kind of being careful of that seventh degree of the scale. Okay. The next two, starting with the Phrygian Sharp 6 scale. So just calling it that because in this numbering system where we're kind of thinking of that first one as Dorian with a sharp 7, this one, the numbering would be Phrygian with a sharp 6. Some people will actually fight me to the death over this. Some people like to call it Phrygian Natural 6 because the 6 in this scale is natural compared to the root, like we would think of it as a natural 13. But you could also think of it as a Phrygian scale where you're sharping the 6. So hopefully that doesn't confuse you too much. But once again, this is another scale that we're going to kind of use with kid gloves. It's a really cool scale, but we don't see it very, very often in conventional harmony. So this is what it sounds like. So yeah, like a little bit brighter version of Phrygian. It's like a Phrygian tetrachord and a minor tetrachord, a whole step apart. The stacked version is a bit of a mess. That's not too bad. We just had the flat 9, natural 11, natural 13 in there. So it's like a Dorian scale with a flat and 9. Because this is not a dominant, that flat 9 would be you know, considered an avoid tone, right? So Dorian, in this case, even though this is kind of close to Dorian, you know, maybe this is Dorian's a better choice for minor 7 still. However, remember what we did to the Phrygian scale in major, what we did to the Phrygian stacked chord in major to make it work. We can do a similar thing with this Phrygian sharp 6 chord. If we take the 11, right? This 11 here and move it down. And then take our third here, move it up here, and now call it a sharp 9 instead. We get that chord, which is a D7 sus, right? Or excuse me, yeah, D7 sus. Which incidentally, actually, now that I'm looking at my PowerPoint, that second chord there, it says D sus 13. That's wrong. It should actually say D13 sus, because the sus is telling us that we're going to replace the third of the chord with the fourth of the chord, right? So that must have been from an old PowerPoint of mine. We're not suspending the 13 here in that case, right? So I think that's a little bit confusing, and I would actually write that chord as D13 sus instead of D sus 13. You may see it either way, though. So once again, kind of like in you know, good old Phrygian from the major scale, there is a functional version of this. Like for instance, here would be one A half diminished with a natural 9 over D, right? So that would be like a chord maybe that would go from here and maybe resolve here to some sort of G minor chord, right? So that would be like kind of a suspended 2 chord in minor, right? Also, there is a modal version of this, though. Remember, I was kind of excited about the modal version of regular Phrygian. Well, there's another modal version here. Check this out. By the way, this upper structure here, we're actually going to see in the next chord. Kind of a brighter version, right, of Phrygian, right? Very interesting modal chord, but once again, we don't see it very, very much in functional harmony, right? But when we do, it's usually functioning as a predominant, some sort of like 2 chord with a maybe a pedal bass or something like that. Okay, but once again, this is not one we're going to be super concerned about. Cool to play around with, though. Next one, the E flat, in this case, Lydian Augmented scale. And we would call this a Lydian Augmented scale because it's kind of like a Lydian scale that has a sharp 5 in it, right? So you can think about maybe having an augmented fifth in the scale. So it's like Lydian and diminished tetrachords. There's a Lydian tetrachord. I mean, would you call that a diminished tetrachord? I think, for lack of a better term, I think that's a good term for that. Whole step apart, right? The associated chord here, stacked version. Pretty cool. Technically has an avoid tone in it, right? Once again, we don't see this chord very often. You know, sometimes you can, maybe kind of like I did on that Dorian scale, I could substitute this scale for a major 7th chord. So say I had just E flat major 7. Right? Just as long as I'm not sitting on that B, but it kind of gives a little bit of color in there, doesn't it? Right? So you experiment with it. You know, you get to that one chord, kind of see if you can kind of mess with that for a second. Here's a few voicings of Lydian augmented chords. So it's a very, very bright sound. I'd say the probably the most common voicing is that you have this triad, sort of a triad off the 3, major triad off the 3 over your bass. You can add a 9th in there. Here's a version a little bit more spread out. A lot of times, though, what we'll hear is we'll hear this as kind of a passing chord, right? Right? There's a very famous tune called Brazil that uses that little passing chord, right? Going from the 5 to the sharp 5 to the 6. But, you know, that's kind of a different version of that, you know, sort of just using it as what we would call kesh, or chromatic elaboration of a static harmony. That's maybe a topic for another video. Usually passing chords. Sometimes in modern jazz, though, standalone. I've written quite a few tunes that have that basic chord in it as like a standalone. Maria Schneider also comes to mind. She has a couple tunes that you know, she uses that chord as kind of a standalone, as a mode. Pretty neat sound. But once again, not very often found in conventional harmony. However, the next one, we got to look out for this one. This is a chord scale that shows up quite a bit, and we can definitely use it to our advantage, called the Lydian dominant scale. So if we look at this one, it's sort of like a Mixolydian scale with the sharp 4 in that, hence the name, Lydian dominant, right? So, you know, kind of a bright version of Lydian. What's neat about this one, no avoid tones in this one. So that's one of the reasons that this is a super, super useful scale. You know, a very, very useful scale to play over dominance. You could also call it Mixolydian sharp 4 in the other numbering system. Let's take a look at some chords here. So pretty much this scale, Lydian dominant, can be applied to pretty much any Mixolydian dominant. So all those Mixolydian dominants that we played before, you know, maybe up to, you know, F13 or so, right? You can play this Lydian dominant scale over those. When you add that sharp 11 in there, right? And that's when it really firmly puts it in that category. There are going to be some other scales, though, that have the sharp 11 in them as a dominant scale. There's a version with the 9th, and then a lot of times what we'll hear is we'll hear the G triad on top, right? And then notice I've been leaving the C out. I'm going to have trouble reaching that. I'll do this. Okay, so there's like the sort of fully stacked version of that 13th chord. Here's probably the most common voicing, right? You know, sometimes you'll hear something like it's a good ending chord, right? So this chord functions in a number of ways. You can, like I said, play it on like a 5/7 Mixolydian chord, but there are a bunch of other ways that this dominant works and moves. So let's check this out. This is very important. So the first way would be as the 2/7 in a key. And I'm making a distinction here between 2/7 and 5/5, because usually what happens is this 2/7 just kind of sits there as 2/7 and doesn't always go to that 5/5 as it might do in classical music. So like for instance, if you look at the tune Take the A Train, and there's a little caveat here that I'll talk about in a second, but we go from this. There's a 2 dominant 7th chord, right? And look what the melody note is. It's that sharp 11. Okay? But that chord then resolves in a parallel direction to just D minor 7. So we get C, playing like a C6 here, D7, D minor. So the most common way that chord functions is it's going to do a parallel resolution to the minor 7th or the minor 2 of the key, right? So that happens a lot. There's a whole bunch of tunes. Actually, we're going to work on that in a tune called Just Friends this semester. Girl from Ipanema has almost the same A section as Take the A Train does. There's tons and tons of tunes that have this 2/7 chord that resolves parallel to a minor 2 chord. So that's the first place that we'd see it. Now, incidentally, Billy Strayhorn there, I think he was thinking more of this scale, which is the whole tone scale. Like if you listen to the trombones and his arrangement, they tend to go right up that whole tone scale. But to me, when I improvise on that tune, I draw from either. Sometimes I'll play Lydian dominant, sometimes I'll play the whole tone scale there. They both tend to sound really nice. And actually, that's a good point about Lydian dominant and whole tone, is they can kind of sub for each other. But we are going to detail whole tone as we move along into the semester. Second one would be 4/7 in a key, and probably the most common place that happens is in a blues progression. So like if I had a blues in C, my 4 chord is F7, and at that point I could play F Lydian dominant, otherwise known as C melodic minor. And this is kind of cool because maybe I'm thinking of that 1 chord as maybe like C Mixolydian or something like that. And if I go to the 4 chord, then I'm thinking of it as C melodic minor. And you know, if you listen to Wynton Kelly on Freddie Freeloader, he goes for that sound quite a bit on that 4 chord. Let's see, who else does it a little? Oh, actually, Cannonball plays that sharp 11 quite a bit also in that same tune on the 4 chord. So it's a nice color on the 4 chord in a blues, or a 4/7 chord in just about any tune or any key. Okay, so those are 2 options when we're sort of like describing the function of that chord as being X in a key. So 2/7 in a key or 4/7 in a key. The next 2 have to do with how the chord actually moves. So for instance, flat 7 dominant moving to 1. And like probably my favorite example of this is in Stella by Starlight. There's that flat 7 dominant. And then we finally get, it's kind of neat in Stella by Starlight, we finally get that 1 chord in bar 9. Stella by Starlight's in the key of B flat. The chord that leads to 1 is A flat 7. Incidentally, Freddie Freeloader that we were just talking about also has that A flat 7 that leads to the 1 chord. In the case of Freddie Freeloader, though, we treat it as a dominant, the 1 chord. There's kind of a special nickname for that. We call it a backdoor dominant. Lots of tunes do this. And actually, lots of tunes, just like Stella by Starlight, go to the 4 chord and then follow up with that flat 7 chord. And I think where that's coming from, like for instance in the key of B flat, is this sort of old cadence where you go 4 to 4 minor to 1, right? So like say we just did that, 4 minor, but change the bass to A flat. We get something that's starting to look like that, A flat 7 to the B flat. Oops, let's try that again. So I think it's just kind of a sub for that sort of older 4 to minor 4 to 1 cadence, just a little bit like hipper, jazzier version of it. So we see that a lot in tunes, though. If you flip through any fake book you have, you're going to find that situation. You're going to find all these situations. That's why we're studying them. The last one that we're going to look at as a very specific way that this Lydian dominant chord functions is as a flat 2 to 1. And a flat 2 to 1 is what? What's another word for that? That's a tritone sub, right? So in other words, like for instance, in a key, like say in the key of C, if I were going from D minor 7 to G7 to C major, I could create a tritone sub, which would be, in this case, a tritone away from the G. So there's like a D flat 9 chord resolving to that C major chord. Very pretty sound, but when we get to that, I'd actually think about playing Lydian dominant on that particular chord. In this case, it would be A flat melodic minor. Right? Okay. So we're gonna look at that a little bit more closely later on when we look at the altered scale, which is also for melodic minor. The other one that's sort of a catch-all is if you have a dominant that moves in some way other than 5/7 to 1. You know, I can't think of the tune offhand now, but there's a tune that actually goes from like B7, resolves up to C major. In those type of cases, I tend to like the Lydian dominant sound. Tends to have, you know, the most benign sound. Speaking of the benign sound, in other words, all of the extensions on this one are bright extensions, right? And they tend not to have the sort of drive that some of the altered extensions have. So a lot of times if I want that benign sound, I will play you know, Lydian dominant. One of my favorite places to kind of think about that is in the bridge of rhythm changes. So you know, the dominants there last for 2 bars. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take the first bar. So like say, you know, in key of B flat, D7 would be our first chord, right? Maybe I would play D Lydian dominant. Maybe for the first part of that, and then I might switch over to like an altered sound and alter some of the extensions to sort of create a little bit more drive towards the resolution of 1. Okay, so I think this is a good place to stop for today. So Lydian dominant, keep those in mind. This is very, very important because when we analyze chord progression, we're going to look for these. So remember, 2/7 in a key, 4/7 in a key, flat 7 to 1, or flat 2 to 1. Those are those big red flag moments that we know to use Lydian dominant. Okay, we'll finish up with melodic minor in our next video. See you then.